The last classic building that we're going to talk about from the Roman classic era before we get into the Christian Roman period and the Byzantine periods is the Roman Pantheon. And if you look at the Roman Pantheon, the first thing that you need to know is that there was a building originally there that was built for Marcus Agrippa. And so when Hadrian, who was probably the patron for this building and even possibly the architect, built it, what he suggested or made them do was inscribe Agrippa basically built this originally, or this is dedicated to Agrippa. And so Marcus Agrippa is the first builder, and then it was torn down, and then the Emperor Hadrian comes along and constructs this building. So this building is really quite an architectural marvel in a lot of ways, and the way that we're seeing it in this photo is not really accurate. It's actually, there would have been walls around it. So let's take a look at some diagrams. Initially, the building would have been placed in a courtyard, and you would have walked up to it and seen basically just this portico that looks an awful lot like the Parthenon as you're walking towards it. So when you entered the building, you would have been surprised and shocked, I guess, in a way, to see this dome structure on the interior. And so in some ways, the basic ideology or the basic plan of Roman architecture is that it tends to be much more shocking, much more dramatic, much more engaging and interactive in some ways than the Parthenon or the classic Athenian age. So again, we're building on that. The other way that it builds on some of the ideas from, for instance, the Parthenon, is that it is a building that's called the Pantheon. Theos is, or theon means religion or gods, and pan means all. So like the panethnic procession, contains all the gods. And it's my understanding that actually you could go inside and there were altars to individual gods around the interior drum of it. So it would have been really more inclusive, and it wouldn't have been exclusive the way the Parthenon, where you couldn't even go inside and you'd have to stand outside and worship Athena from afar. In this instance, it's round and it's inclusive. Now, the other thing is that in terms of the overall symbology or iconography of the building, what you could probably say is that that circular form is also a sort of all-encompassing form, and it's continuous, almost like the dome of heaven. And the other thing that I think that it relates to is that I know that you're probably taught that they didn't think that the world was a sphere or round, and that the planet was flat. That's not necessarily true. There were actually people in ancient Greece and also in ancient Rome who believed that the planet was a globe and that it was sort of a universal form. And they had even computed the actual circumference of the globe as well. So that would tie in a little bit with the structure, because if you look at the cutaways, and you can tell that it really is a form that's built mainly on a circular kind of form. Now, the other thing that I think is kind of important is the uses of the different technologies that we just discovered, or not just discovered, that they had discovered at that time. For instance, there was an extensive use of cement and concrete to build the dome, and there was also that arch technology. So if you were to take an arch and rotate it 360 degrees, basically make it a circle, the keystone at the top that we had studied before would become the oculus in the top of that. And the oculus is just basically a hole in the roof with a ring of stones around it that lock it into place. And the circulation of that arch creates a dome-like structure. Now, the dome that is created by the concrete and the cement the cement is slowed down, it was actually poured in to make what's called coffers in the ceiling. And one of the best ways to take a look at this is actually to look at a painting by this guy named Giovanni Panini from the 1600s. So this painting shows you actually the dome on the ceiling, and shows you how the coffers were poured cement. And that hole in the ceiling would have been used to allow smoke to come out. And the interior structure itself was this structure that was polychromed, because it was basically brick and cement, and then other kinds of stone were placed on top, different colors of stone. And the actual, for instance, the columns and things like that aren't really there to support it. That dome is supported mainly by a drum that runs around the exterior of it, and also by the cement and concrete and brick that's used to build it. So we kind of need to go back and take a look at the overarching form of it again and some plans of it. So if you look at the plans and you compare it to the actual building, one of the things that you'll also see is that the coffered ceiling, the way that those things are scooped out, probably was a way of relieving some of the weight as it moved up, and it also provided an optical illusion that would move your eye up to the top. And if you look at the coffers in any depth, and we will in a second, they also pull your eye out, almost like perspective, although they didn't have linear perspective at that time. The drum has a series of barrel vaults that run around the interior of it inside. And this dome is also stepped up, and the cement gets thinner and thinner as you get near the top, near the oculus on the very top of it. Now, they also changed the composition of the cement, and what I should mention is one of the things that the Romans did is that they figured out certain kinds of sands, like sand from Pazzuli, would actually, that's a volcanic sand, would slow the drying process down so that they could work the cement and mold coffers and things like that a little bit more, with a little bit more leisure. The other thing that they also figured out is that they could change the composition of the cement by adding volcanic rock, which is very porous. If you've ever picked up a volcanic rock, it looks really heavy, but it's super light. So they mixed that in as the gravel as they got near the top. Otherwise, this thing would be very top heavy and could cave in almost like a souffle. And so they figured out how to do that. And one of the other details that I think is really cool is that if you zoom in on the side of the drum from the exterior, you can actually see there's a series of arches built around the drum inside the brickwork of it that provides even more support in the structure. So they actually incorporated a series of arches to redistribute force and send it down into the side walls. Now, some of the other interesting little details about it is that you can see that the decoration on it is a sort of combination of decorations that we've seen from the classical world, kind of pseudo Corinthian columns and Tuscan order, and the entablature is a little bit riffing on some of the Ionic and Corinthian types and Tuscan styles. The interior of the building is really an exercise in drama. When you walk in, you're confronted by all this different colored kinds of light bouncing off of all of these different kinds of surfaces. And so you have this almost Baroque way of combining different colors and different architectural orders on the interior. For instance, all these like sort of little huts or altars that run around the bottom of it have slightly different architectural orders, and those are supposed to be exterior architectural orders. They're almost like a temple within a temple within a temple. The oculus at the top that we had looked at before really is a way of relieving some of the stress, allowing natural light to come in and smoke to come out. But students always ask me, so rain gets in, right? And birds and stuff. Yeah, well, rain does. And so what they did with the floor is there's actually a slope to the floor and a series of drains that run underneath it. And since the floor is basically made out of stone, the surfaces would not have been hurt or damaged in any way. Interesting also little details about this building, sort of contextual details, is that when Christianity came to power, and finally when the Catholics were in full force, especially during the 1600s in the contemporary era, one of the things that they did was they converted this into a church. It was basically a Catholic church. So when Raphael was around in the 1500s and he died, he asked to be buried there, and he is. So right now it's actually a church. And one of the other things that for instance, Gian Lorenzo Bernini needed in the 1650s, he needed bronze enough to do a construction project inside St. Peter's, the Catholic cathedral. And what the Pope gave him permission to do was take the doors off of the Pantheon that had been there for centuries and melt them down. So there's a joke that sometimes the tour guides say that whatever the barbarians didn't destroy, the Barberini did. So this building was the largest dome in the world at that point in time, and was also probably, I think, the largest building of the time, and combines all of the technologies: cement, concrete, domes, arches, different compositions of cement, and then also uses lesser materials for the construction of it, and facades or veneers the interior to make it look like a really fancy temple, and in a way was more permanent because it wasn't painted surfaces like you would see on the Parthenon or the Areopagus Augustae.